The recording has started. Welcome again, everyone, to another series in CPD in 43. Today we are on our second event for March. Today is a Fire and Life Safety in Buildings from Hassan Ahmed from R5 Consultants, who provide this service up and down the country. So what I will do is, obviously, as I mentioned, I highlighted the calendar which is shared on the screen. You can see the entire year. That will slowly be released via social media and onto the Eventbrite page, but please do save the dates for these events. As usual, the event is recorded and will be uploaded to YouTube in due course. It's unlikely, unless it's provided by the speaker, CPD certificates are prepared and sent across due to, in essence, the time it takes from admin. But otherwise, I look forward to the presentation, and please do remember that we have the Q&A session that follows the 30 minutes of presentation. If you do have any questions, please do field them into the chat box. We will then be asking those at the end of the talk. And without further ado, I will hand it over to Hassan, and I will disappear into the background.
Thank you, Osman. Osman, give me a thumbs up if you can see my screen.
I can, but it's in presentation mode, so it's a lot smaller on the screen. Perfect.
How's that? Excellent.
Yeah, perfect.
Excellent. So it's nice to see some familiar names. What we're trying to do today is something a little bit differently. We'll talk about the BRPD duties during construction. I'm mindful a lot of the people here may have been to a number of these sort of seminars where we're always talking about Gateway 2 or what's required for Gateway 3. So we're going to try and talk about what's in the middle and how to get to Gateway 3. And then once we've done that, I'd like to just drop off and talk about a couple of common pitfalls that we often see in fire safety design when we're reviewing drawings. Okay, so firstly, just a bit of an introduction about myself. I'm a chartered architectural technologist with a little over 15 years in design practices, and more recently taken on the role of practice compliance lead in respect of BSA. As of January, I joined R5 as a principal designer and client advisor. And then across the 15 years, I've led numerous private and public sector projects ranging from 1 million to 100 million pounds. And that includes residential work, transport, education, and healthcare sector work as well. Just a bit about R5. We offer strategic retained support to design practices, contractors and clients. We also offer project by project support in an advisory capacity, although more often are appointed as the principal duty holder. Okay, we'll talk about, I won't spend too long talking about the new regime. We all know how we got here. From decades of deregulation leading to the Grenfell tragedy that claimed 72 lives and affected more. The Phase 2 inquiry report was published in September last year, and I would recommend reading that if you haven't done so already. It's a stark reading. Okay, and then we'll just go on to the principal designer duties. And if you want to read these in detail, they are available on the government legislation website under Part 2A of the building regulations as amended in 2023. But we'll just run down the main headlines. So firstly, design management and compliance. So that's principal designers are to plan, manage and monitor design phase to ensure regulatory compliance. So it's important to understand that that design phase will typically occur during the construction phase as well. So design phase isn't restricted to RIBA stages 1 to 4. It will go through 5, 6 and 7. So next, coordinating all design work so that if built accordingly, the building would comply with all relevant requirements. And then finally, under design management and compliance, taking all reasonable steps to ensure compliance and mitigate risks associated with poor design coordination. Okay, secondly, on the slide, we've got coordination and collaboration, and that involves ensuring designers, contractors, and clients work together effectively and facilitate cooperation between all parties involved in the design process, including the client, principal contractor, and other designers. And then liaising with the principal contractor to share information relevant to the planning, managing, and monitoring of the building work. And then lastly on the slide, oversight and responsibility. So considering feedback from the principal contractor on compliance-related matters and supporting the client by assisting in the provision of information to other designers and contractors when requested. So it's a similar tone to CDM there. And then ensure the designer's work is properly coordinated to maintain safety and compliance throughout the project. Okay, hope that all makes sense. And then, so why does all that matter? Now, I'll take you back to the phase 2 of the Grenfell inquiry, which was completed last September by Sir Martin. And Sir Martin said during the announcement of that, when they've wrapped it up in September, one of the quotes he said was that each of the main players assumed that compliance with the building regulations was someone else's problem. Not one person or organization took control of ensuring that what was being designed and built was actually compliant. So in response to that, the government suggested or came up with the principal designer role, ensuring that design safety and regulatory compliance and accountability are upheld from the start to the completion of a project through implementation measures to prevent design failures and reducing risks, in turn paving the way for a safe and well-coordinated construction process and ultimately ensuring safe occupation for building users. Okay, so the elephant in the room that no one really talks about. So as I said, we've been to many of these webinars and seminars where we talk about Gateway 2. We're all fairly comfortable with what information is required for Gateway 2, and similarly, the information that's required for Gateway 3. But how do we bridge the gap? How do we get one from Gateway 2 to Gateway 3? Now, understand as well that I think the last time I checked, which was about 2, perhaps 3 weeks ago, we're currently up to about only a handful of new build Gateway 2s that have been approved. So this is uncharted territory for most people. So what we've tried to do is add our thoughts and sort of try and demystify what that process would entail. So firstly, proactive strategies to facilitate compliance. And that might involve ensuring design intent is understood and followed. It's critical, actually. Establishing clear communication protocols with the principal contractor and other duty holders to ensure the design intent is understood and applied on site. I mean, that really is critical. And then also regularly reviewing site feedback or queries and ensuring timely clarifications to prevent deviations from approved designs. Now, I'll elaborate on that a little bit. That RFIs, for example, typically when we get an RFI, we would usually have around 5 days to deal with that RFI. And admittedly, I've done it myself where it lands in the inbox. Day 4, that's when I'll open the RFI. Not ideal, but it does happen. Now, in an era when we're governed by building safety regulator, particularly on a high-risk building, that RFI that comes through, it may lead to a change control, perhaps worst case, a major change control. Now, so once that RFI lands, you want to make sure that you're reviewing the RFI as soon as practicable to at least inform the principal contractor, the client, that there's a potential major change that needs to be anticipated. So that's just a bit of advice. Just take that on board as you move along, and then document any agreed design changes, ensuring they meet regulatory and project requirements. Moving on to the golden thread, just golden thread management, overseeing updates to the golden thread, ensuring that contractors submit accurate as-built records, testing results, and compliance documentation. Conducting document reviews to ensure submissions are complete, accurate, and aligned with regulatory expectations. And then moving on to active engagement with duty holders. So just on this sort of section, it's kind of circles back to the previous slides about accountability and essentially being a lead designer. And what I suggest is scheduling and participating in regular coordination meetings to track progress on compliance critical activities such as fire stopping, compartmentation, structural safety, life safety items, and the like. Requesting progress updates on testing and commissioning to identify any potential delays or issues proactively. Now, that's not a duty that should sit with the principal designer themselves, but it's important to know who needs to be involved in those discussions. So as a principal designer, you'd be expected to bring those parties around the table and ensure that they are also reviewing those items. And then finally on the slide, we have checklists and progress tracking. Now, most of us should be familiar with project quality plans. I think practices over a certain size have to have project quality plans. And in some instances, you might even have to be ISO 9001 accredited, which goes there's a lot more to it in terms of quality management systems. Now, what I would suggest is creating a project quality plan or updating any that you already have in response to the Building Safety Act, and particularly HRBs and non-HRBs. So using structured checklists for reviewing design, changes, compliance documentation, and testing schedules to avoid gaps and inconsistencies. Now, broadly speaking, a lot of that would be there'll be you'd have a standardized list across projects. Not all will be applicable across all projects, but at least you've got a starting point. And then more project specific, maintaining a compliance statement to monitor progress on key deliverables during the construction phase. So that compliance statement there, it's the same compliance statement we refer to in Gateway 2, where you submit your compliance statement with all the different relevant sections of the building regulations, and then it's a case of monitoring that as you go through the construction phase, ensuring that there's no change to the process. How do you put this? So the principles of the decision that were made at Gateway 2 to ensure that that's not changed, and at Gateway 3 that should hopefully make that process of getting the completion certificate a lot simpler. Then capturing safety critical items as listed in the construction control plan in a checklist will also assist. So the construction control plan doesn't necessarily have to provide a schedule of all your safety critical elements, but it does need to list what they are. Now, what I'm suggesting is perhaps that project quality plan we spoke about earlier, maybe build that into your project quality plans, so that will assist with the process of seeing through a Gateway 2 to Gateway 3 project. Okay, then next slide, moving on to how to simplify the Gateway 3 submission through proactive coordination. So key actions for HRBs, that could include confirming the required evidence for Gateway 3. Yeah, for example, the structural safety documentation is being prepared and aligned with the approved Gateway 2 design. So we need to make sure we're having these conversations much earlier and not leaving it the last 4 weeks of the construction period. We need to plan these things well in advance. Proactively engaging with the principal contractor to verify commissioning schedules for fire safety systems such as sprinklers and structural components are on track. Touched on that earlier. and ensure that unresolved design or construction issues are addressed before the completion certificate application. So going back to the original point, we're going to make sure these things are done well in advance, and so that it doesn't cause you any problems when you get to the Gateway 3 application, completion application. And then for non-HRBs, now I have intentionally not said much about non-HRBs because the government have already given us the prescribed the prescribed functions in relation to HRBs that address the duty holder requirements. Now, so in theory, if we follow the same prescribed functions on non-HRBs, that should surely ensure compliance with our duties on non-HRBs as well. Now, I'm not suggesting we go to the same level of detail when it comes to non-HRBs and following those prescribed documents, but the format is there as a benchmark, so we can use those, and it's there for everyone to use. And a little bit more about non-HRBs then. So encouraging the adoption of so just elaborating on that point. So encouraging the adoption of similar oversight principles to preempt issues that may arise during final building control inspections, and then facilitating a coordinated approach to hand over compliance critical documents, even if not required under the same level of scrutiny as HRBs. So the obligations for providing Regulation 38 information, that's no different. So that will still be required for non-HRBs. So hopefully that all made sense. I have condensed that presentation from a half day into 20 minutes then. But what I'd like to do now is just for the last 10 minutes, I'd like to just go through some common design pitfalls that we often see in fire safety design. And this isn't necessarily from the architectural profession. It's also from fire engineers, from MEP consultants, across the spectrum. Right, so I've listed what they are there, the most common ones that we see, and I'll elaborate on them as we go along. So partition deflection allowances. Now, quite often, when we come to establishing that criteria, it's usually led by the structural engineer. Structural engineer would tell us whether that be 15 mil, 25 mil deflection allowance. We would then typically go to the likes of British Gypsum, find a detail that can suitably provide that level of deflection. So again, whether that's 15 or 25 mil. However, there seems to be very little consideration of sort of compression and as well as expansion of the joint. So typically, when you approach a structural engineer, they'd give you a value based on the compression from the floor above. Now, what it doesn't necessarily take into consideration is the live and dead loads on the floor itself. So the partition, the floor that is on. So on that floor, there will be live and dead loads subjected to that floor. Now, that will essentially pull the elements further down and potentially expanding the joint. Now, this is actually it is actually noted in approved document B and 9999, British Standard 9999. Although in particular in those sort of scenarios, it talks about partition deflections underneath protected steel. Now, that's a different subject. We'll stick to this one just without the steel. Now, PFKG, that's the Pacifier Knowledge Group for anyone that hasn't come across them yet. They've done some research into this as well, and it is a common issue that's presenting itself across a number of tier 1 contractors as well that we're working with at the moment. So it is a significant issue and it does need addressing. And what you'll often find is when you do allow for the expansion and compression within the joint, the standard detail from British Gypsum, it's drawn in such a way that it only allows compression. Now, to allow both, you've got to make sure that it's installed in the neutral position. And this is actually also included in British Gypsum's deflection head guidance documents. So it's interesting. Have a read of it. It is really useful. And then we'll move on to fire dampers and surface penetrations. So, I mean, this has probably been in industry, and everyone's, I don't say everyone, but it has been talked about probably more so over the last 12 to 18 months. And this is in relation to the testing criteria for fire dampers and surface penetrations. So, excuse the jargon, the fire dampers, they're tested under EN 1366 Part 2. Surface penetrations, on the other hand, are a different test standard, and that's EN 1366 Part 3. Now, the supporting construction, i.e. the partition or the wall in which it sits, the supporting construction requirements under the two test standards are subtly different. And what you find is, under the fire dampers test standard, supporting construction would say, what it says within it, that the partition lining, i.e. the plasterboard, needs to be a Type F plasterboard. Now, a Type F plasterboard, if you go to the likes of British, I'm not familiar with the other manufacturers. I know there's a couple of other CIAT, Knauf, I'll use British Gypsum. So British Gypsum's Type F plasterboards would be the Fireline board, Duraline board, and Sound Block F. I think there are some others, but they are specifically used for encasements, so we won't talk about them. So there's only 3 partition linings that would qualify as a Type F plasterboard. If you then look at 1366 Part 3 for surface penetrations, again, supporting constructions, the requirements are detailed. It says the same thing about Type F plasterboard. However, in addition to that, it says, or the partition system can be classified under BSEN 13501. So essentially, what that means is it has to be a classified, fire-tested partition system. So if you go to the likes of British Gypsum, you can get a designated partition that gives you 60 minutes of fire resistance. And that's essentially that fire resistance criteria that's been given is on the back of a 13501 classification that's been undertaken. So what that means is for surface penetrations, you're a lot more flexible with the types of plasterboard linings that you can use, whether that's a Type F board, Type A, B, C, D, however many boards there are. Generally speaking, as long as it has a fire test to support it, from British Gypsum or whatever manufacturer that may be, then you can use whatever that plasterboard is comprised in that partition system. So the same flexibility doesn't apply with fire dampers, because there is no rule for allowing fire classifications to be used, and it only cites Type F boards. As I said, you can only use Fireline, Duraline, and Sound Block F. So it's a coordination issue that you've got to bear in mind when you're selecting your partition types, essentially. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. The next one, fire door spacings. Doing quite well for time. Fire door spacings. So the test standard for fire doors is 1634 Part 1. And in there, you have spacing criteria for fire doors. So what I mean by that is when you've got 2 doors, not a double door, but say a riser, for example. A riser, you might have 2 double doors that are, the door jambs are back to back, butted up to one another. Now, there is no test evidence for that. It's not covered in the test standard. The test standard allows for it. Well, you have to allow for a 300 mil nib in between the two doors to satisfy the test criteria. That's 300 mil for stud walls and 200 mil for masonry walls. Now, it is worth having a conversation with whoever the door manufacturer is that you're specifying for that particular job. They might have undertaken bespoke testing. But what you've got to bear in mind is if you are undertaking bespoke testing, because bespoke testing doesn't have a test standard for it, whatever's been tested has to be identical to what's built on site. So, your field of application is really, really limited. So even if that particular manufacturer has carried out a bespoke test, you really need to look at the test evidence to understand what else does it include within that. Okay, so, and then lastly on my list, I wanted to just touch on a fire door resistance criteria. So Appendix C in Approved Document B, and I think it's also Appendix C in 9999 and 9991 as well. They refer to, if you read the fire door designation in the table, all of the doors they only require protection in terms of integrity, not insulation. Now, just to clarify why the insulation isn't a requirement, it's not a requirement neither in the 1634 Part 1 the test for fire doors, just to point out. And the reason why that is essentially a door is a transient route. Now, generally, there won't be any fire loading, or there shouldn't be any fire loading butted up against on either side of that door leaf. And so this is the reason why insulation isn't really considered a requirement under the criteria of fire door resistance. However, when you've got situations where you might have a fixed side light with a door, that's it's part of the door essentially. In that scenario, your fire door may still just have to carry the integrity rating, still may not require the insulation rating, because again it's a transient route. There's no particular fire load on either side of it directly butted up against the door. However, where you've got a fixed side light, you need to consider that there probably will be some fire loading on either side, and therefore the screen or the glass within that would need to have an integrity and insulation rating as well. So hopefully that was quite useful. It was a whistle-stop tour, and final few slides then. Some of the services that we offer on the screen, and lastly, Q&A.
Thank you so much, Hassan. Just wanted to quickly go over, because you mentioned quite a lot of technical documentation. So can you just go, the ones that come to mind, can you just go over those so I can type those in to the chat box, just in case anyone wants to do any further reading?
Yeah, of course. It was, so for fire dampers, it's EN 1366 Part 2.
EN 13, did you say?
Yeah, 66 Part 2.
Yep, and then
service penetrations, or service penetration seals, it's EN 1366 Part 3.
1366 Part 3. And is there anything else that comes to mind that you
said? Yeah, and then the last one I mentioned was the fire doors. So the test criteria for that was 1634 Part 1.
Perfect. I'll send those in the group chat in a second.
What I would suggest is, if anybody's got time, honestly read the test standard, because it really makes you understand why we do things the way we do it. And when somebody asks you whether we can do this, you can always refer back to the test criteria and you'll understand why you can't do it, because it is really useful.
Great. Sorry, I'm just putting those into the group chat just so. Okay, great. I think if anyone has any questions, please do ask. Just to sort of start it off, thank you for that. you mentioned about common pitfalls in regards to very specific sort of items.
Mm.
You mentioned that you guys have submitted quite a large number of Gateway 2 applications. Um, During that sort of time, in regards to assisting on those applications, what are the key points that you feel like are coming up on a regular basis where you're having to sort of go back and clarify items?
So there's one in particular which I didn't list on the slide, and that was particularly in relation to a lot of the fire strategies that we see. Now, quite often, when we get to Gateway 2 submissions, we're seeing fire strategies with still recommendations within them, options of design options within options, and it's just so unclear as to what the scheme actually entails. So what we're saying is, and we've run this by the regulator and their MDTs as well, and they're expecting at Gateway 2 a fire strategy that essentially is a compliance report. They want a definitive document that says what the design entails. And well, it makes sense. And just having a conversation this morning on LinkedIn with someone about the sort of the approach that fire engineers have. I think the trouble is fire engineers still have this sort of uh, debate about whether or not they're designers. They absolutely 100% are designers. They're influencing that process. So really, we need the likes of fire engineers and others. It feels like I'm sort of unfairly pointing the finger at fire engineers. I am to some degree, but generally, the whole basis of the Building Safety Act is that everyone needs to come forward and be accountable. So that's one of the key things that we've seen coming up, and it's. I mean, to be honest with you, I'm having to address it almost on every single project. And as I said, I personally have submitted 2 Gateway 2 submissions in the last month. Naz, I don't think he's been able to make it onto the call. That's my partner. So I think he's going to be, by the time we get to the end of the month, he's looking at 15 to 20 applications. That's just Gateway 2 applications. So we are engaged in quite a lot of these sort of feedback sessions as well with the building safety regulation, which has been really, really useful.
Great. Um, just another question in regards to the Building Safety Act. Obviously, one common point is that people tend to think it's just relating to fire, whereas it's much more far-reaching than that. So if you could touch on that point, that'd be really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, if you have a look at Part 2A of the building regulations, throughout the entire list of regulations, it always talks about the relevant requirements. And then when you get to the end of Part 2A, it clarifies what the relevant requirements are. The relevant requirements are a whole host of regulations before you even get to Schedule 1. And then and then Schedule 1 is essentially Part A, B, C, D, all the way through to T. So got to ensure that it is building regulations compliant, not just Part B compliant. Does that clarify that?
Yeah, no, that's great.
Yeah.
I know it's a common misconception,
Yeah.
obviously, because of
Mhm.
obviously the tragedy that happened. It comes up quite a lot where people assume it's just relating to fire. And then
Yeah.
you touched on another really interesting point, which it would be really interesting to pick up on, is in regards to the collaboration of the entire team, and also furthermore clearly indicating the responsibilities of those members under the relevant stages of the project. Obviously, they're duty holders in one way, shape, or form, but also as well that there's that regulatory mechanism that we need to ensure, in essence, is working properly. So if you could sort of elaborate on that, that'd be great.
Yeah, I mean, what I would suggest is, as principal designer, it's essential that we sort of um, set the benchmark and we're in prime position really to set the tone of a project, and that's making sure that all the scopes are in alignment. And I appreciate, alignment of scopes and the like aren't always within our gift. It's often the client or it might be the contractor as well. But as principal designers, we have a duty to bring these things to the table, challenge it. Now, if you take into consideration things like a traditional DRM, a designer's responsibility matrix, that's a means to ensuring that all the duty holders are doing what they should be doing. So I think for anyone that has a standard DRM within their practice, I really think it's worth going through it again and just making sure that all the roles and responsibilities are suitably aligned. And if you've got any gaps, that needs to be highlighted to perhaps, if you're working on a design and build project, it needs to be agreed. It needs to be agreed with the principal contractor, doesn't it? Because at the end of the day, if you're going to be suggesting that some portions of the project require subcontractor design, then you need to be transparent about that, because there might be some elements of subcontractor design that need to be considered as part of the gateway to submission, whereas there may be some others that could be submitted with an approval for requirements and agreed at a later date. So we've got, the regulator has now come out and clarified their position on approval with requirements. So they're not saying that everything needs to be approved. Just you have this approval with requirements process as well. But just going back to the point, Usman. So yeah, it's critical making sure that all the scopes are aligned. DRMs, really important. Compliance statements as well. So compliance statements in terms of sort of highlighting who is responsible for each particular aspect of the building regulations. Now, it's all well and good saying, part B1 through to B5, it might be the fire engineer, it might be the architectural designer. Part A, it might be the structural engineer. However, what we've got to consider is we need to go a lot more granular than that, and we need to break it down into different criteria, design packages, whatever you want to call it, and then list who is responsible for that element. That element belongs to Part A or Part B, and we do that via a compliance schedule. I'm not sure if some of the guys in the group here may have seen some flying around. That's how we do it, and I think I believe that's what the regulator is expecting as well.
One thing probably I just want to touch on is a lot of people are waiting for things like templates and things like that, but that's I just want to sort of clarify that point. And obviously as well, I noticed that you didn't, probably with good reason, didn't show anything within the presentation, and I just want to touch on that specifically, because that's, again, probably, if not actually the most or the second most asked question. So I just want to sort of that point I want to press on and have you sort of discuss that a little bit more, please.
Yeah, so the regulator has said from day one that they're not going to provide any templates, which, to be honest with you, I don't really agree with, because at the end of the day, it's only going to make their lives more difficult, because they're going to get 100 different versions of the same document. That it just the whole idea doesn't seem feasible to me. I think there should be some government produced templates that everybody fills in and adds as they need to add, depending on their project. In terms of where we are, yes, we've got a whole suite of templates for our projects. That's the compliance statement, construction control plan, fire and emergency fire, partial completion strategies, the whole shebang. So we've got all of that. Are you going to ask me to share it?
No, I didn't ask. I didn't ask that. I think that's where I think there's. Oh God, you might get questions now. Uh, I think that's where the critical point is, and where people are treading a very fine balance in regards to complying to relevant legislation, and also I think that's probably why the list of people who are on the relevant gateways having submitted applications are having to wait a long time, because people are submitting with the mindset of maybe previous applications for other matters, or not having swapped hats regarding to the Building Safety Act. So there's lots of potential reasons for that.
Yeah.
But I'll leave you to potentially add to that whilst I read. I think a question has just come in, so just let me just quickly read this. This will probably be the final question, by the way. So principal designer building regulations appointment for design and build contracts come up regularly where a contractor is appointed by a client, whether competent or not, but they want to appoint us instead, which we know can't happen. What are your thoughts on this?
I know where this question's come from, and I think I've answered it before, but I'll answer it.
Okay.
I'll answer it officially.
Thank you,
So
Emery, for that question.
yeah, so competency. So we've got four elements: the skills, knowledge, experience, and behaviours. Now, any one particular, so for in this instance, the principal contractor doesn't have the same competencies or the required competencies to fulfill the requirements of a principal designer. Now, as part of the behavioral aspect of the competency requirements, one of those aspects, or one of those requirements under behaviors is accepting where you don't have the competency to do something. If you don't have the competency to do something, you can appoint somebody else to come and fill the hole, essentially. It's the same way we as practices, as organizations work as well. Not any one person has the skill to do everything. We function as a team, and that's the point.
Great. I think that covers sort of all of the questions that we have for now. But obviously, if you do have anything further that you want to pick up with Hassan directly, please do reach out to him. Any project-specific requirements, and please do reach out to him directly. I'm sure he'd be happy to have a chat. His details are up on the screen. If I just reshare the schedule for the remainder of the year with yourselves, just bear with me a second. We have a really interesting series of events for the rest of the year. So please do save the date for these, and we look forward to seeing you at those. You'll see them up on the screen now. They will be released up onto the CIAT Wessex Eventbrite page. But for example, we have our next event, which is on the 16th of April, and it's one every month. So we've got the 16th of April, technical drawing standards from Dan Rossiter from the BSI. And then we have psychological health for ATs from the Architectural Benevolent Society on the 14th of May. On the 11th of June, we have how ATs can shape health and well-being from Anne Banner. 16th of July, we have Celebrating 60 Years in 43 Minutes from Andam Endicott from Central Office. We've got on the 13th of August, we've got Reducing Embodied Carbon with the structural engineer Will Arnold from IStructE, who's a board member of the IStructE and specializes in carbon reduction, embodied energy, and also has been involved with the proposal of Part Z. 17th of September, we have Limiting Thermal Bridging by Design by Matthew Brooke Peat, Dr. Matthew Brooke Peat. So that'd be really interesting. He's been involved with a lot of stuff. So for example, TWE and so on. 15th of October, we have Planning Regeneration and Update for 2025. Obviously, there's been a lot going on, so hopefully that's really useful. And on the 12th of November, wildlife friendly lighting design from Jennifer Neal. And then finally, to bring up the end of the year, on the 10th of December, why specify natural slate and phyllite from Simon Johnstone from SSQ Riverstone. We are booking into 2026 now. So if you do have any suggestions for talks for next year, we have, I believe, already booked Q1. So we are looking to book into Q2, 3 and 4 for 2026. So please do let me know if there's any specific topics you'd like us to cover. And if there's any specific speakers you'd like us to put forward. So with that, thank you again, Hassan, for the talk. That was really great. Thank you again for everyone for attending. I look forward to seeing you next month, and let's bring it to a close.
Thank you, Ahmed.